President Trump dumps the head of the Veterans Affairs and wants his doctor to take the job. Trump's lawyer flirted with pardoning associates in the Russia probe. China's flirting too, with North Korea. Citizenship lands on the U.S. Census. The victim of another police shooting is laid to rest, and it's only Thursday. I'm Molly Roberts, with editor and writer Jim Downey, Global Opinions editor Karen Attia, and editorial board member Stephen Stromberg. We'll be looking for thoughtful questions and comments online, so please give us your best stuff.
Say his name.
You're watching an anti-gun march, but not led by the Parkland kids. These protesters are grief-stricken and outraged over the deadly police shooting of Stephon Clark, who is being laid to rest in Sacramento today. The 23-year-old, who you can see here in a picture tweeted by his partner, was unarmed and holding a cell phone when he was gunned down by police outside his grandmother's house on March 18th. We have helicopter and body camera footage of the incident, which unfolded as police responded to complaints of a person breaking car windows in the neighborhood. The helicopter footage is on the left and the body camera footage on the right. This contains graphic content, but it's important to see.
He's looking into another car that's in between the fence and the front yard.
Over here.
Started ground unit Scott, so it looks like might be getting one at gunpoint.
Hey! Show me your hands! Stop! Stop! 5-7 south. Show me your gun!
Trying to catch him.
Show me your hands! Gun!
Shots fired, shots fired.
Copy, shots fired.
Show me your hands! See your hands!
That was 20 shots. Clark's death has revived protests calling the justice system systemically racist, but White House spokeswoman Sarah Huckabee Sanders says police shootings of black men are a local matter. So I'm guessing we don't totally buy that. Is this a local matter, Karen?
Absolutely not. I mean, it's even just to watch the footage again and to hear those shots again, it makes my blood just go cold again. And it's sad and telling that as we are approaching the anniversary of the D.C. riots, as we sit here in Washington, D.C., that some of the same inequalities, the same issues that Martin Luther King Jr. stood against, police brutality, unequal treatment of black people against the law, that we're still facing today in 2018. And, our colleague Wesley Lowery has written about, well, police are still killing black people, right? But why aren't we talking about it? And it's almost like, we covered Ferguson, we covered Baton Rouge, we covered when there were protests and people in the streets. And now, since then, obviously, Trump takes up a lot of the oxygen. But these things are still happening. And I just think it's another reminder that, coupled with Alton Sterling, the not guilty or no charges to come in that incident, is just a reminder that we are still fighting this fight, and in an administration that is obviously does not see this as a national problem. Right?
I mean, I think part of the response to Sanders and the White House is to say, well, yes, it is a local matter. It's also a state matter. Mm-hmm. It's also a national matter, in so much as it implicates a large national issue, as you identify, but also in the sense that we used to have a Justice Department that would look at questionable uses of force in a much more aggressive and reasonable sort of way. And now, obviously, that's not a priority for this Justice Department. Of course, if this had been an immigrant shooting a white person, you would have the president, who would probably be the first one tweeting about it in the morning. We have no doubt about that, and I think the rhetoric from the podium from Sarah Sanders would be markedly different.
Right, so we've been fighting this fight, like you said, for years now, and in the national eye since Michael Brown. Have we made any progress?
I mean, at the very least, right, under the Obama administration, there was at least some efforts, right, to start investigations into problematic police precincts. We saw that in Chicago. I think all of this is just to say on a state level, on a sort of social conscious level, just how how fragile progress can be, right? That we had all this attention, we had the hashtags, we still have Black Lives Matter, but to recognize that progress is always fragile and can be rolled back. And again, this is a reason why Colin Kaepernick, right, and the NFL, why he started these protests. This is the police brutality that he was standing up against, and to this day, he still does not have a job, right? And so it's just a matter that this fight is made harder, right, by an administration that doesn't seem to take it as a priority, right?
And we should note that the Attorney General in California, Becerra, is actually looking into this, and you know, part of what's important about that, and when state authorities and federal authorities in other cases have stepped in, is you know, right now we have a certain amount of evidence that looks not so good, and as you say, I mean, it's chilling to watch that video, but you know, what you want is a thorough and fair and complete investigation of what happened here, what these officers were thinking, whether their stories all line up, you know, why they kept firing after you know, after obviously he was down on the ground. You know, you want answers to all these questions, and there's always a certain you don't want to necessarily leave that just to the local authorities who might be conflicted about whether or not to go after police officers that they work with.
We have a comment from a viewer. Nia Avalon says, all police need to be retrained to de-escalate instead of the shoot-first mentality with which they have been subjected. So I guess along those lines, Jim, does that make sense as one move forward? Are there other?
Absolutely. I mean, our you know, Radley Balco has documented for us extensively, both with us and our previous publications, how police training is in the United States does not emphasize de-escalation of situations, and that's one of the biggest things. I mean, right here you see that Stephon Clark is on the ground, and then they fire 15 more shots, and you know, and we see it again and again and again where situations immediately spiral out of control due to conscious or unconscious biases in a lot of cases. And the fastest way to address that is to have training, better training for police that emphasize de-escalation. And we've seen it work both at the few local constituencies that have done that, but also in other countries that adopt that approach.
So, speaking of Trump taking up all the oxygen, shifting gears now to this week's White House personnel changes. We're starting to get used to this. President Trump tweeted Wednesday evening that he has fired David Shulkin as Veterans Affairs Secretary, and is pleased to announce he intends to nominate highly respected Admiral Ronnie L. Jackson, MD, to take his place. Dr. Jackson is the White House physician who told us in January that Trump has incredible genes. So, first, why is Shulkin out? What happened here? Can someone give us the background?
Well, I mean, he would argue, as he did this morning, that he did so. He was forced out because he opposes the privatization of the Veterans Administration, and that obviously it's the second largest government agency by personnel. It serves millions of Americans, and to privatize it would be an absolutely massive overhaul. And an absolutely catastrophic mistake in a lot of ways, where you know a lot of veterans depend upon it for care, and obviously that the Veterans Administration has fallen down on these issues in the past, but compared to private insurers and the rate of care is still much better.
Now that's of course what
What
he would argue exactly, and again he did in the New York Times this morning and elsewhere. There are some other issues, of course. One of which is the trip he took, and some of the ethical questions about. You know, he got free Wimbledon tickets and brought his wife onto a trip to Europe, and these sorts of things. I mean, those actually do raise legitimate questions. It's totally unclear to me whether those actually were the animating features of the decision to fire him. And so there's an open question on that. It sounds like there was an extremely uneasy relationship between the Trump administration appointees that were appointed to work below Secretary Shulkin and Shulkin himself. And particularly the flashpoint was this question of privatizing the VA. and that after a while the tension became impossible, and Shulkin ended up losing out to the Trump administration appointees. I mean, anyway, that's what it sounds like happened. As for whether or not it was a wise decision to tap Dr. Jackson, he actually is widely respected. This isn't just sort of Trumpian hyperbole. He gets high marks from Obama administration folks as well as from Trump. So that's a good sign. But he's a doctor, not an administrator necessarily.
Right.
And so there's a big open question about whether he'll be able to run, as Jim said, the second largest agency in the government. You don't want to grade on a Trump curve,
Too late.
But so not grading on a Trump curve, that's a sort of a concern. But grading on a Trump curve, at least he's not just sort of some random commentator on Fox News who sort of bloviates and then Trump likes it, and then all of a sudden he's running the government. So
Right.
at least it's not that.
At least.
Right. Everyone this week was talking about how Caroline Sunshine, a former Disney
Yes.
Channel star,
Yes.
had been hired to be a press assistant. It seemed to me she had a bunch of Republican internships. She was pretty well qualified compared to some of these other people. I don't know why we're mad about her.
But even in a broader perspective, I think you could look at this in the last weeks with Tillerson's ouster, Rex Tillerson's ouster as Secretary of State, H.R. McMaster being replaced. It just seems like Trump is feeling emboldened to make the personnel decisions that he wants and to shape the White House and his administration in his own image. I think I read that it's almost like a hall of mirrors now. Like he's getting the people that he wants and that he likes. And so some people might think that would be a cause perhaps for concern
Right.
versus perhaps people who might be vastly more qualified to undertake
Right.
what he's tasking them
Yeah,
to
well,
do.
a series of internal checks on the president, from H.R. McMaster to Rex Tillerson to Gary Cohn, they're all gone now, and you see instead enablers of some of Trump's worst instincts coming into power, and that's, one wonders how this could possibly be healthy. I'm sorry, Jim. I cut you off.
And I think that part of that what's exacerbating that is that at this point, pretty much the only people who want to work in the Trump White House are people who are all in on Trump. We've seen reports that even people who normally basically the revolving door of people who go into government come out as lobbyists, because the job will be there immediately for them. Republicans are finding that's not the case with this White House, and it was even the case in the late Bush administration, as unpopular as that was. So the only people who are interested in working for Trump are people like Larry Kudlow, who have completely bought into this government by amateurs.
I just
Right.
wonder if he found out via tweet,
Probably.
And this doctor was just so impressed with Trump's genes that he is now
No.
excited to go all in.
like Jessica Jones. If you're watching that. That's
So
the first thing I think.
I have another viewer comment, this one from YouTube. Angela Hall says, "The level of corruption in this administration is unfathomable. I've never seen anything like this in my 50 years. And Rolling responds, even worse than under Obama. A note, Rolling also said, hi, I am a Russian bot, robot emoji, beep, beep, you must vote for Trump. We love your engagement, guys, but let's raise the bar here. Let's bring in some substance. There's a lot of style. I like style, but we'll find the balance.
Beep, beep, dash, dash, beep, beep. We'll respond back.
They're already taking over.
Okay. As President Trump moves chairs in the Titanic, the New York Times is reporting that Trump's former personal lawyer discussed pardoning two key figures in Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian election meddling and possible obstruction of justice: Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn. John Dowd, Trump's lawyer until he jumped ship last week, may have floated the idea of getting them off the hook last year. So, if this is true, what does it mean for Mueller's investigation? This seems to fit into the obstruction of justice thread.
Yeah, no, it does. It's just another sort of brick in the wall that, well, that's a bad metaphor, but it's another piece of evidence, another element to consider when you're considering an obstruction of justice charge or accusation. The particular issue here, of course, is not necessarily the pardon itself. The president's pardon power is fairly unrestricted.
Right.
There's nothing Congress could do, or the Justice Department or Mueller or anybody else. But it was the offer, the potential offer, and whether that was actually direct from Trump or just something Dowd was saying offhand or something Dowd was saying while freelancing. That's a big question mark, we don't know. But if it had come directly from the president, and we know actually, P.S., that Trump was around that time asking about his pardon power, so that's a little, sort of the timing's a little fishy. You know, if that did come from Trump, if Dowd was acting on behalf on Trump's orders, well, that would be really significant. You combine that with the firing of Comey after trying to get him to sort of back down on his investigation of Michael Flynn. You combine that with the other elements, and that it looks even worse. But again, right now we sort of need to know what Dowd was thinking and doing.
Right. So what might we imagine he was thinking and doing? So he floated this idea about Flynn and about Manafort. Now we see that Flynn seems to be cooperating, pled guilty. Manafort is saying, I have nothing to plead guilty to. So what is he trying to achieve with each of these people, and what's the likelihood that a pardon would get what he wants?
Well, the natural inference from looking just at the facts we have on the table is that Dowd was trying to compel Manafort and Flynn, or at least give them some reason not to cooperate. And that would suggest, you know, the next inference from that is that there was something perhaps that Flynn and Manafort had on President Trump that Dowd didn't want to get out. Now, but again, we're sort of jumping ahead of we're inferring from the facts we have. It might have been, some people are saying, well, it was maybe just sort of, it might have been an offhand comment. You know, we don't know how serious the offer actually was. There seems to be, it could be that Manafort is not, he continues not to cooperate. He's insisting that he's going to go to trial. You know, he's actually under a lot of pressure from Mueller, has a lot, you know, he's basically a lifetime in jail ahead of him if he loses. But he's still not cooperating. Maybe he's counting on a presidential pardon.
Right.
But again, all we have right now is speculation and a little bit more smoke, honestly.
Jim, you looked like you were gonna...
Yeah, I was going to add that exactly. I mean that this would go a long way towards explaining why Manafort, when there's such a strong case against him, you know, overwhelming evidence of just shady transactions, et cetera, why Manafort is not talking, even though most defense lawyers would be telling him you need to talk, like you need to cut a deal.
Right. And of course,
I'm just saying, just to be clear, I mean, Manafort, he belongs in jail. I mean, there's no question. You know, a pardon would be, you know, this would be sort of Joe Arpaio pardon level of sort of obnoxiousness. He's broken. I mean, you look at the indictment and it's just devastating. So you know, this is not somebody who's deserving of a presidential pardon.
Right, and of course, there's still the question of whether Trump is going to sit down with Mueller, which John Dowd did not want him to do. So what could Trump be trying to achieve in that interview? Is it possible that the question of pardon comes up? Is there some good explanation he can give about why this might have been floated? Are there good explanations he can give about any of these things he's done that could be viewed as obstruction of justice?
I mean, I think that the Trump, you know, sort of assuming the best motivations on Trump's part, if you want to do that, the argument would be that he didn't actually personally collude when he says no collusion, there's no collusion, he's not necessarily saying that Paul Manafort wasn't a sketchy guy and Rick Gates didn't have sketchy connections, whatever else. What he's really saying is, I didn't see any of this. I know nothing about this. I was just some sort of running this weird, improbable campaign that that unwittingly, you know, and in the process, I unwittingly got this sort of help from the Russians.
Right.
You know, you could see how if you're coming from it from that perspective, you'd be kind of annoyed when everybody keeps saying that you're a Russian agent.
Right.
But in fact, you know, you hired Paul Manafort and Rick Gates. I mean, they're there on your staff. You have to own up to a degree, at least, for that. And then you also have to own up for if you're President Trump, your complete misunderstanding of how the Justice Department works and what's appropriate for you as president to do and to ask of the FBI and the Justice Department. You know, lessons that he continually fails to learn.
Right, so we'll get back to Manafort and Gates because there's more news on them. But for the record, because it's always good to go for comment, the White House press secretary is, surprise, surprise, shrugging off the pardons report.
Are pardons pardons on the table for anyone involved in the Russia probe?
Look, I would refer you back to the statement from Ty Cobb in the report that you're asking about, in which he said, "I've only been asked about pardons by the press and have routinely responded on the record that no pardons are under discussion or under consideration at the White House."
So, back to Manafort and Gates. The special counsel's team filed court documents this week indicating that in the run-up to the 2016 election, Manafort, who was Trump's campaign chair at the time, and his deputy Rick Gates were in contact with the maybe not-so-mysterious Person A with ties to the Russian intelligence service. So, first of all, let's talk about Person A. Who is this? It seems like people have kind of an idea of who this guy is, a fellow named Konstantin Kilimnik. That could be horribly pronounced, so please correct me on that. And why is this pertinent to the investigation? Why does this matter so much?
Well, Rick Gates, of course, was Paul Manafort's deputy, and in fact, he outlived Paul Manafort on the campaign. At the time, he had this contact with this apparently Russian agent. He was still on the campaign. He was the liaison to the Republican National Committee. So that's another sort of direct connection between the potentially direct connection between the Russians and the Trump campaign per se, rather than maybe an ex-staffer or something like that. The fella that Gates was supposedly in touch with was apparently an officer of the GRU, which is the Russian Military Intelligence Service, and was in fact known to be. Now, Paul Manafort has always denied having any kind of connection to Russian intelligence. This would seem to puncture that claim. So that's the significance,
right.
And again, getting back to sort of what Trump should have known and what Trump should have done. He hired these people were on his staff, and as the one leading the campaign, he has responsibility for hiring people who had these connections. And so that's another element of why it's pertinent, why Trump just can't say, "I knew nothing about it, there was no collusion, go away."
I think also that, the old saying that it isn't always the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. I mean, I think it's pertinent here that, all this stuff is about people talking to Paul Manafort, people talking to Rick Gates, or people talking to Michael Flynn, and maybe even if Trump doesn't know anything about that, if stuff like the pardon, the potential pardons, et cetera, are tied to him, that in and of itself could become an obstruction of justice issue, and that may end up being what gets him rather than directly these things.
So that's a lot of Russia. Moving away from it, at least for a second. At least 12 states are planning to sue the Trump administration for adding a controversial question to the U.S. Census, whether respondents are U.S. citizens. Attorney General Jeff Sessions recommended the addition, but critics say it will discourage immigrants, legal or not, from responding to the decennial headcount, which means bad news for Democrats. White House spokeswoman Sarah Huckabee Sanders, again, dismissed criticism that it's a GOP power grab.
Look, this is a question that's been included in every census since 1965, with the exception of 2010 when it was removed. We've contained this question that's provided data that's necessary for the Department of Justice to protect voters and specifically to help us better comply with the Voting Rights Act, which is something that is important and a part of this process. And again, this is something that has been part of the census for decades and something that the Department of Commerce felt strongly needed to be included again.
As we listened to that, it seemed like everyone here was doing the thinking emoji. Exactly.
Or the sort of stroking chin emoji, skeptical.
Yeah, that's the same. We're talking about the same emoji. We just have different lingo for it. It's
interesting.
But I mean, for one thing, there was no census in 1965, like she said. So I don't know what wires were crossed there. Right. But so the rationale here about protecting voting rights. Can someone lay out for us what the idea is there, and then maybe lay out for us why perhaps it might not be so persuasive, Karen?
It's just really interesting because I think a lot of people might make the case that this is an administration under a Justice Department that seems to not care very much about protecting voting rights. So, yeah, it's odd, to say the least, that, oops, speak of the devil, to say the least, that that this would be a reason to do this. So I think, yes, obviously there's the political issue of whether or not sort of tampering or messing with the census is going to benefit Democrats versus Republicans. I think, as for me, as someone who is a daughter of immigrants and speaks to communities of color, part of what this does at a very basic sort of optics level is reinforce the notion that we have a White House or have an administration that is looking to try to curb or monitor the sort of demographic shifts, right, that is happening in this country. Who was it, Santor? Who made the comments about, the comments about demographic shifts being kind of a scary.
How long a list do you want?
I know, but there's this sense that the argument has always been, Republicans need to take in mind that like America by a certain date that's coming soon is going to be a majority, perhaps black, brown, or mixed country. Therefore, they need to take that into account when perhaps they're pushing policies that marginalize or don't benefit these communities. But I think, from a very, there obviously is the constitutional issue of this and the political issue, but from an optics perspective, it sends this message that the nation is looking to try to, again, keep track of who deserves to be here, perhaps begin a sort of process that could potentially facilitate targeting people based on how they responded to the census, right? And make them more of perhaps a target for, as even Sanders said, the justice system. And that, yeah, of course that's scary. That sounds very scary, and that doesn't sound like the country, the free country, the welcoming of immigrants that we've always sort of held ourselves out to be for so long. So it's disturbing, frankly.
We have 2 Facebook comments I want to bring in before I go to Jim and Steve. So Nia Avalon, who is back. Nia, you're on fire today. Thank you for your participation.
Yeah, #1
says
fan
that
today.
the change says that the change to the census will only result in wretched data, reduced resources for schools. And Martha Medrano says, protecting voting rights by what? Giving all our information to Cambridge Analytica?
But even so, it's even like, how do we know that people would be able to trace back or be able to answer that correctly even? And it's just like, what is the point and why now, right?
So the argument that that the Justice Department makes is that in order to carry out their civil rights, their voting rights enforcement, they need more specific block-level data of where voters reside. And currently, there is a citizenship question on the American Community Survey, which goes out every year to a small sample of American households. It's a few percent. And the claim from the Justice Department is that that's just not precise enough when we're talking about figuring out whether, say, a district line is drawn in a fair way because there are voters here, there are voters there. And when you're trying to determine, for example, whether minority voters in a district will be able to elect the candidate of their choice, then you need to have that kind of information is their claim. Of course, the Justice Department has been using ACS, this community survey data, for this purpose for a long, long time.
Right. I think that's partly what Sanders was referring to when she says it asks about citizenship. She means that ACS
Well, there's another wrinkle in that they used to ask on the long form of the census back when that existed, a citizenship question.
Right.
That ended in the last time they did that was in 2000. So in 2010 they didn't have that. They replaced the long form with the community survey. This is all in the weeds. The point is, though, that this administration doesn't exactly have a lot of credibility when they say, "Oh, we're doing this to protect minority voting rights." Right. Particularly when you have, minority and civil rights groups, almost across the board saying that adding this question is a bad thing. So, what's the real motivation? Well, there is actually some serious politics, at stake here. One thing is when you reduce the apparent number of immigrants particularly in some of these blue state, big metropolitan cities, then those states like California, then you reduce their representation in Congress because representation in Congress and in the Electoral College that elects the president is all based on the total number of people, not just voters. And that's been that way since the founding of the country. So this is not a new thing. So if you just reduce the raw number of people who are returning their census forms and you get an inaccurate picture of how many people are in Los Angeles, then California loses. The other thing that Republicans might do is when you're electing local representatives to state houses, to state Senate, state House. The Republicans have been trying to move toward not counting non-citizens, non-voters in that count, and this would facilitate that change, and that again would advantage rural areas over urban areas generally. So within a state like Texas, that's not in danger of going blue immediately on a national level, but you could really destroy, further erode Democratic influence in, say, the state house if they went toward this new system facilitated by the new census question.
And I just want to add that I mean, it's, we could spend the whole show on the GOP war on voting rights, but this is, I think, this is a federal instance of it in a lot of ways. I mean, we're seeing this at the state level where the Pennsylvania Supreme Court just struck down what was an incredibly gerrymandered, but legal until the Supreme Court ruled. It was legal under Pennsylvania law and in most states, and even Democrats have used it in Maryland. Right. But it was incredibly biased and took away and basically watered down representation for Democrats. Right. So we've seen this, from local to state to federal, and this is just another example of Republicans basically. I mean, this is a party that won the White House without winning winning a minority of the popular vote. So it works. It worked then. They're going to try and keep it going.
So we could spend the whole show on the GOP war on voting rights, but we will not. We have one last topic. Finally, as chaos unfolds here at home, President Trump is determined to keep the drama going abroad and meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in May. Kim met Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing this week, his first visit to a foreign country since taking power in 2011. We don't know much about the talks, but they come as the United States is pushing North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. So, Karen, tell us, how big a deal is it that China and North Korea met?
This is a massive deal, obviously. Again, against the backdrop, especially the ramping up of the rhetoric, particularly between the Trump administration and Kim Jong-un and North Korea. Trump, for a long time, right, has been saying that China needs to do more. China needs to do more to help sort of mitigate the tensions and play a bigger role. And so for China, not to say that China is doing this at Trump's bequest, but it does, again, show that the role that China does have to play as a major power in the region. So in a way, it kind of oddly proves Trump right, perhaps, in some ways. And it does set the stage for broader engagement in May, I would say.
Right, and Trump is saying this is a win in my maximum pressure campaign against North Korea, and this is actually good for me. So what do we see happening with the Trump campaign? I mean, not with the Trump campaign, with the Trump administration. What success do we see, especially as North Korea and South Korea head into talks, and how might John Bolton, our new national security advisor, figure into that?
Sure, right. I mean, this is all happening, first of all, this is all happening without, as far as State Department is concerned, I think we should still keep up the awareness that we still are lacking an ambassador to South Korea. We're still lacking some key diplomatic outposts there. And now, yes, with the arrival of John Bolton, who has written about, he's a proponent of striking North Korea, right? So I definitely think this will be an interesting sort of test case for the new State Department under Bolton. I can totally see that the Trump administration will use this as an example of his sort of brand of engagement with so-called autocrat, or with not so-called, definitely autocratic regimes. But particularly when it comes to, I think it'll definitely be a test for the incoming Secretary of State, John Bolton, as well.
Trump, of course, tweeted his best spin on this, which was, well, previous administrations have never been able to accomplish denuclearization, and now there's a real chance that I might be able to do it right now. And of course, there is no real chance that's going to happen. Let's keep in mind the sort of tried and tested North Korean playbook, which is you test weapons and you threaten your neighbors and you behave recklessly, you get your attention, then you use that as leverage in talks to obtain relief from sanctions and other concessions, and then you continue subsequently to produce your weapons, and there seems to be no real divergence in that particular scheme right now. And of course, China is, as always, the key element here. It's propping up the North Korean economy and has for decades. If you want to stop North Korea, you do actually have to go through China. Through Beijing, but this idea that President Trump, by sitting down with Kim, is going to suddenly produce a magical denuclearization of the peninsula. What they really mean, what North Korea really means when they say that is, well, we'll give up our weapons when basically American troops leave South Korea, and you have a situation, a military situation on the peninsula that's far more favorable than it already is to the north. And these are conditions that will never be accepted. So.
And on John Bolton, I think it comes back to the point we were talking about earlier with all the firings and the lack of checks. I mean, and as Karen was saying, the administration that Trump wants, but also the lack of checks on the president. That this is, well, first of all, John Bolton is, he cooked intelligence to sell the Iraq War. This is a classic chicken hawk and a guy that avoided service in Vietnam, but now has not found a war that he doesn't want to start. That hasn't found a regime he doesn't want to bomb, but like many Iraq War architect, he manages to still have a job in Washington, and he will. But one thing he is good at, unfortunately, is he is very good at bullying his way through bureaucracies, and he'll have far fewer obstacles now, including he won't have Senate confirmation as an obstacle. He'll have far fewer obstacles now to push a very belligerent foreign policy. And one, by the way, that even conservative North Korean North Korean experts such as Victor Cha, who was going to be the ambassador to South Korea until he had to pull out because he didn't agree with the administration on this. Even people like Victor Cha and other sort of fairly hawkish experts say a quick strike, which is what Bolton advocates, is not going to work.
Right.
It's not going to work.
Right. So that is distressing news, and I have more distressing news still, which is that we are out of time. But we're never out of opinions. So keep up with our views at WashingtonPost.com/opinions. And if one Trump firing a week isn't enough for you, remember, it's only Thursday.